Welcome Life Science learners to another installment of Life Sciences. Today we're focusing on a topic called homeostasis and coordination. So what is homeostasis? I'm sure you guys have thought about this. So we're going to need to unpack that. We're going to be looking at how homeostasis is maintained in the body. We're going to try and focus on concepts like negative feedback, and we're going to try and see how different conditions are maintained within what we call a stable internal environment. Okay, so let's get into the concepts of this lesson. So, have you ever thought about the following? How is the temperature of the body maintained constant? And you know that recently we've had to constantly measure our body temperatures when we've entered different venues or you've been to school. And you would notice that generally there seems to be a normal temperature range which everyone's looking out for. So what is it that keeps the body within that normal range? So it's quite interesting that there's a complex mechanism behind all of that that ensures that the body temperature remains the same. If we consider other things that remain within a normal range, think about your heart rate. Your heart rate has a normal range which it fluctuates around. Often when you go to a doctor, he checks your blood pressure and he'll tell you, well, it's within the normal range. So what is it that keeps the body within this normal range? And that's what we need to unpack today. So I have a multiple choice question for you. And so it reads, homeostasis is the following. Let's choose. Allows for a widely fluctuating internal environment. B, is impossible in vertebrates. C, is the maintenance of a relatively stable internal environment and often incorporates a form of feedback regulation. Or D, is the maintenance of a relatively stable external environment and often incorporates a form of feedback regulation. So these are four options that are quite similar, and hence I would engage with you during the lesson, and hopefully at the end of this lesson you're able to explain what homeostasis is and give us a concise definition for that. So let's look at the concepts that we're going to discuss in our lesson today. So we're going to unpack what the definition is of homeostasis. We're going to look at how homeostasis is maintained in the body. We're going to unpack the two systems that bring about balance and coordination. We're going to have an overview of what the nervous system is and how that coordinates body functions. We're going to have to overview what the endocrine system is. We're going to spend some time looking at a concept called negative feedback. And we're going to bring about a comparisons between the two systems. And then finally, we're going to look at what happens when homeostasis fails. So let's get straight into the lesson. As we normally do, we need to look at the key words and some important concepts. So the first term that we're going to be unpacking is homeostasis. The next concept we're going to look at is the mechanism of negative feedback. And in that we're going to look at what a receptor is, what an effector is, and what the nervous system does. We will also look at how the nervous system uses nerve impulses. We're going to spend some time looking at chemical messages in the endocrine system. We're going to look at what hormones are. We're going to try and understand what a normal range is and possibly discuss some abnormalities when things do not function within the normal range. So, the illustration I have on the board essentially shows you someone trying to balance on what we know is kind of a balance or a seesaw. And you know that at some point when you've been playing around on a seesaw, things eventually need to balance out for individuals to be kind of even on either side. If not, you'll find that if it's an unequal balance, you'll find that the seesaw tips in a specific direction and you realize that, oh no, you're going to need to do something on the other end to bring it back to balance. So essentially, the body has to constantly do that. There's always a change from one to the other. And so the body compensates for that by bringing about a response so that that balance can be maintained. So we need to look at why this balance is important, and I'll answer that question in a little bit. So, homeostasis is a process of maintaining a constant internal environment within the body. And I'd like to repeat that. So again, homeostasis is a process of maintaining a constant internal environment. So think of all the conditions in our body. They always fluctuate within what we call a normal range. And that's the constant range that we refer to. So all the mechanisms that are responsible for maintaining this constant internal environment is essentially maintaining homeostasis. So the internal environment refers to the blood and the tissue fluid that surrounds the cells of the body. Homeostasis enables the body to function efficiently despite changes that might occur in the external or the internal environment. So essentially what homeostasis does is that it is a mechanism that keeps the body at a constant level. So if it's winter, you know that it's really cold and your body tends to lose heat. However, in that process, we don't cool down. So the body still maintains its core temperature around 36.9, 37 degrees. So why is it that we can still be functioning normal, yet the temperature outside is extremely low? And that's because the body has mechanisms to ensure that the core temperature remains within the normal range. Essentially, that happens when you consume a meal and your blood sugar levels increase. So the body has to compensate and bring that blood sugar levels back to normal. And so these are mechanisms that are responsible for that, which we need to look at in a bit. So, how is homeostasis maintained? In this illustration, I've described to you essentially the process of what balance is and what happens when the body responds to these changes. So what's going to happen is that the body will pick up a stimulus, and that's a receptor that picks up that stimulus. It will then inform the control center, and that control center is going to send a stimulus to an organ called the effector. That effector will then respond to the stimulus and bring about a change, and that change will try and bring the body back to a balance or restore what the imbalance was. And so this cycle of events ensures that there is a stimulus that is received. The control center responds to that by sending an impulse to the effector organ, thereby bringing about a change. And that change establishes what we call the balance, which was created by a change in the variable. So that's in an overview. So as I mentioned, homeostasis is a complex process that consists of individual units working in a particular sequence to balance and give in response to a variable. So all your homeostasis mechanisms consist of 4 separate units, which we will unpack now. A stimulus, which is what the stimulus is in terms of the body understands as a change. A sensor or a receptor that identifies the change. And then a control center which interprets that change. And then the control center sends out a message to an effector organ to bring about a change in an opposite manner to restore the balance. So these are the 4 systems or components of homeostasis. So what is a stimulus? A stimulus is something that results in changes within the system involving the variable. So if you have a meal and your blood sugar increases, that's a stimulus. If you exercise and your heart rate increases, that's a stimulus. So there are various stimuli that the body has to respond to. So these are then sent to a control center. Now, the stimulus represents that variable which has moved away from what we call the normal range, initiating a process of homeostasis. This will then follow a stimulus being received by what we call receptors. So it is a sensor or a receptor that senses or identifies a unit of homeostasis, where it monitors and responds to the change in the body. The changes in the system are realized by the sensor, which then sends the information to the control unit. So, in our body, we've got stimuli that come in, we've got sensors in our body, and often these are in the brain, but in various other parts. And then the brain will analyze the stimulus, and it'll interpret that and identify a change from the normal. It will then respond using the effector. So that control center is once again going to interpret that, and it's going to send information that then needs to be received by an effector organ, and that is through identifying something that is against the normal value. If the value is different from the normal, the control center will activate an effector organ, which then brings about a response to that stimulus. So let's look at what an effector is. An effector can be muscles, it could be organs, glands, or similar structures that are activated as a result of a signal from the control unit. An effector is a target which is acted upon by the control unit to bring about the value of the variable back to normal. The effector is essentially counteracts the stimulus to nullify or to bring the effect back to normal. So we've looked at the stimulus, we've looked at the receptor, we've looked at the control unit, we've looked at the effector. And let's try and put that all together into a summary of what we've looked at. So in this segment, we've looked at the concept of homeostasis. We've tried to understand what homeostasis means in terms of maintaining a constant internal environment. We've also looked at the process of how the response is created. So there has to be a stimulus, which is then received by the control unit. The control unit then processes that information, identifies a change from the normal range, and then institutes or sends out an impulse to the effector organ. The effector organ could be glands, could be muscles, but could be various other organs that respond to that change and then bring about a change in the opposite manner. And that will then try to bring the balance back to normal. So guys, we've unpacked what homeostasis is. You guys need to have a little break to get back to normal, relax, breathe, get some oxygen into those muscles, and then we will start with the next segment. So see you in a bit after the break. Welcome back, life science learners, to the next segment. Just an overview of what we've already done. We're looking at homeostasis today and how the body maintains what we call balance. So we've got to understand what homeostasis means, but we also need to recognize that the endocrine system is what maintains homeostasis using hormones. Now, what are hormones? Hormones are chemical messages that are produced by glands in the body, which are endocrine glands. So we have many different types of endocrine glands that produce chemical messages called hormones. And these hormones have specific target areas and carry out specific functions. And essentially, all of these bring about what we call a balance in the body. However, we also have a very important and kind of, I would say, the most crucial part to functioning and maintaining balance in the body would be the nervous system. And so in the nervous system, we're looking at the function of the brain and how that maintains coordination and balance with regards to the normal functioning of the body. What's also important to recognize is that both of these systems, namely the endocrine system and the nervous system, function interdependently. That means that these systems work together to bring about balance. And so let's try and unpack that in this segment, and we'll try and compare the systems and look at essentially how balance and equilibrium is brought about. So in this segment, we're going to look at the systems that bring about coordination and balance. Okay, we're going to look at, let me just select my pen. We're going to look at how this balance is achieved. Let me just, so we're going to look at the systems that bring about balance. We're going to have an overview of the nervous system, and we're going to overview the endocrine system, and then focus on the concept of negative feedback. So getting back to the process of balance and equilibrium. So as I mentioned, there are two systems that bring about coordination and balance. And remember that coordination and balance is the term where we refer to as homeostasis. So another way to say balance and equilibrium or coordination is homeostasis. So the endocrine system and the central nervous system are major control systems for regulating homeostasis. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, the endocrine system is a system that works using hormones. Okay? And so we'll have to unpack what hormones are in a bit. And the nervous system is a system that uses nerve impulses. So these systems, so they use nerve impulses, and these nerve impulses bring about what we call coordination. So collectively, we need to look at both these systems. So the nervous system can detect deviations from the body's normal equilibrium, so that is the state of homeostasis, and it sends messages to the affected organ to counteract that disturbance. Now, going back to our initial segment where we looked at the four components of communication in the body. So you have a stimulus, you have a receptor, you have the control unit, and you have the effector. So if we apply those four concepts to the communication mechanism, we would understand how the nervous system does that as well. So you have a stimulus, which would be an impulse that you get from the environment or a change in the body. You then have a sensory cell or something that responds to that and engages or identifies that change or that stimulus. And then you have a control center. And in this case, when we look at the nervous system, it's going to be the central nervous system, which is the brain. And that's going to then interpret the stimulus, and it's going to respond to that by sending an impulse to an effector organ. So you guys in grade 10 would have looked at types of neurons. We've looked at sensory neurons, we've looked at motor neurons, and we've looked at interneurons. So the sensory neurons transmit impulses to the central nervous system, and you've got your effector neurons that bring about a change by responding to that change and sending an impulse to an effector organ. So that's kind of the loop or the cycle of how coordination happens with the nervous system. Right, so over a relatively short time, it restores the required balance. Now, so if we talk about the nervous system, it occurs within a short period of time. And we'll know that nerves travel very fast so neurons are basically your nerve cells, and they carry nerve impulses which travel extremely quickly. And these impulses can bring about a change in a short time. And this restores what we call the required balance. Both systems act mostly automatically, but there is some voluntary control over the nervous system. So essentially, balance and coordination is an involuntary process. What does that mean? It essentially means that these processes occur without our conscious control, meaning that if the body temperature increases, the body recognizes that and responds to that by putting in mechanisms to cool the body down. Although you try to fan yourself or drink some water, the body has its own natural involuntary mechanism that decides to bring about changes within to bring it back to normal. So the responses that bring about change are involuntary, meaning that we don't have control over them. And so that's the amazing part of how the system of homeostasis is. So you might have a meal, there would be an increase in your blood sugar levels, and the body will intrinsically or involuntarily respond to that and bring about a change so that the blood sugar levels come back to normal. So it's not consciously done, it's done through the system, through an involuntary response. Cool. So the nervous system provides rapid coordination using electrical impulses, which travel around the body extremely fast, from about 1 to 120 meters per second. So that's extremely fast. And if you think about how quickly that is, the fact that you're able to think, click your fingers, respond to light, pick up something quickly, think, those are all nerve impulses that travel extremely fast. And so this is the body having a highly effective coordinating system that brings about an instantaneous change. And that's through impulses that travel in neurons. And these are, as I said, that travel extremely rapidly. And sometimes the fact that you can think about something and your brain processes that information talks to the speed at which these impulses travel. So the nervous system is an organ system that coordinates voluntary and involuntary actions by transmitting signals between different parts of the body. The central to the function of the nervous system is an extensive network of specialized cells called neurons. Neurons are able to communicate with other cells by chemical or electrical means at specific connections called synapses. So we know that the nervous system uses electrical impulses. So in grade 10, we've looked at specialized animal cells called neurons. And these neurons are specialized animal cells that are able to conduct impulses. And so these serve as an effective neural highway or pathways for impulses to travel and bring about coordination, both through a voluntary as well as through an involuntary response. So if we compare that to the endocrine system, so let's look at the endocrine system. The endocrine system works with the nervous system to coordinate and direct the activity of the body's cells. It provides a slower but longer lasting coordination than the nervous system. So as I mentioned earlier on, the endocrine system is made up of various different endocrine glands, and these glands produce hormones. Hormones are your chemical messengers that travel in the bloodstream. And if you think about that process, the bloodstream has a relatively slower process of transporting an impulse. So it means that the endocrine system uses hormones in the bloodstream that get to the effector organ to bring about change. So it's a relatively slower process. However, it is a longer lasting process. So the effect of the endocrine system has a longer lasting effect. The effect of the nervous system has a quick, immediate, and a short-lived process. Cool. So we continue looking at the overview of the endocrine system. As I mentioned, the endocrine system uses chemical messengers in the form of hormones. These are chemical substances that are secreted by cells into the extracellular fluids, that means outside the cells, and they regulate the metabolic activity. Now, we've brought in the term metabolic activity. So this essentially points to all the physiological processes that happen. So respiration, digestion, enzyme activities. These are all metabolic processes. And many of these rely on enzymes, and many of these rely on the stimulation from endocrine glands. Blood transfers hormones to the target cells at much slower rate. The target cells or the target organs will respond to the organs that are being produced by those hormones. The target cells must have a specific protein receptor in order to be affected by the hormones. We're going to pause and differentiate between the two in a bit, but let's try and understand what happens. So as I mentioned, that hormones are released and they travel in the bloodstream. However, these hormones are received by specific cells because cells are designed to identify certain hormones. On the surface of the cells, there are special recognition signals that identifies hormones. And so a hormone has a specific cell or target area because that cell will have a signal receiving component that identifies a hormone. Unlike your nerve impulses, which travel specifically via a neuron to a target or effector organ, hormones travel in the bloodstream and hence reach certain target areas where they are recognized by what we call recognition proteins that then receive them and then allow the hormone to act on that organ or tissue or target area. So as we continue, it's important that we pause at this point and we compare the two systems. Essentially, I need to remind you that there are two systems that coordinate functioning and homeostasis in the body. It's important at this point that we compare the two and try and understand how homeostasis is maintained. One, a very effective system that works instantly. The other, also an effective system that takes a little while to work. And let's compare these two and understand the subtle differences between these two coordinating systems in our body. So let's compare them. The endocrine system, the communication is through chemical messages that are transmitted in the bloodstream. So these chemicals or hormones are released into the bloodstream. However, if we look at the nervous system, we've got communication that happens through nerve impulses that are transmitted by neurons or nerve cells. So when we compare these two, you can see that chemical messages travel in the bloodstream. Here you've got nerve impulses traveling through nerves. The second comparison would be hormones broadcast all over the body but influence target tissues only. And essentially, as I mentioned earlier on, these hormones are released into the bloodstream that can travel through all the parts of the body, but they will have a specific target tissue only. And that's because cells have certain receptor signals that identify hormones. However, your nervous system sends impulses via neurons, and these travel to specific target cells and not throughout the body. So your neurons are specific to a target area. However, your hormones can travel in the bloodstream throughout the body. Let's look at the next difference. A target organ or glands that secrete specific hormones. So these would be glands or hormones that produce specific hormones, and we will look at examples of these. Whereas when we compare that to the nervous system, this causes muscles to contract or glands to secrete a stimulus or a hormone or a secretion. So this would be targeting muscles or glands, and here you've got organs that are being targeted on the endocrine system. Let's look at another difference. The hormones has an effect over many minutes to several hours or even longer, whereas your nerve impulses through the nervous system has an effect which happens within milliseconds, as I pointed to you early on. An example of that would be, say, let's look at an example of a hormone which is the growth hormone. And so the growth hormone is gradually released from the pituitary gland that targets your muscles, your organs, and that helps for the growth and development. And so we see that this growth hormone is released gradually as children grow, and so that stimulates bone, organ, muscle development. However, if we compare that to how the nervous system functions, and when an impulse is sent, it works instantaneously within milliseconds to bring about a response. So here we're seeing a much slower, longer-lived process, but on the nervous system, we're seeing a quick, immediate, short-lived process. Key to understanding how these two systems work. So as I mentioned, the effects tend to be long-lasting, whereas in the nervous system, the effect tends to be short-lived and often reversible. So we've got to unpack what the negative feedback loop is. And this is a concept that we need to understand. So the word negative means, another word for that would be opposite, and feedback is a response. So there are several different systems that bring about changes. We talk about a negative feedback mechanism as well as a positive feedback mechanism. So let's try and understand what a negative feedback loop is, and then we'll look at the examples between a negative loop and a positive feedback loop. So a negative feedback loop serves to reduce an excessive response and keep a variable within the normal range. An example of this would be, examples of processes controlled by a negative feedback include the body temperature, the control of blood sugar levels, and even your blood pressure. So that's a negative feedback loop. So let's end this session by looking at the concept of negative feedback using this diagram. So as I mentioned, at the start, we have a stimulus, we have a sensor cell that picks that stimulus up, we have a control center that processes that, and then we have an effector that responds to that. So that's the chain on the loop of how this process of feedback occurs. So the negative is an opposite feedback, and the loop refers to a chain of events that occur. Let's look at the negative feedback using the example of body temperature. So the body temperature, when it exceeds 37 degrees Celsius, which could be because of physical exertion, it could be because of an infection, you'll find that the sensor would be the nerve cells in the skin and the brain. These will then receive that stimulus. So the stimulus is there. It will then be processed by the brain, which is the control center. In the brain, we have the hypothalamus, and I'll say that again, the hypothalamus, and that's what regulates the control of temperature in the body. This will then send an effector response to the sweat glands throughout the body and the skin to bring about a mechanism of cooling. And so this loop that we see is a mechanism that ensures that we have feedback due to a response. So guys, we need to unpack this in the next segment. We need to unpack what the negative feedback loop is, and we'll try and understand how it works in the context of other examples. You guys have done well. You've stuck in there. It's been a long session. You deserve a break. Freshen up, get some water, and I'll see you in a bit. Welcome back, life science learners, to our final segment today on homeostasis and coordination. Just a recap of what we've done. We've looked at the difference between the endocrine and the nervous system as two significant control systems in the body that maintain what we refer to as balance and equilibrium. Let's look at the concept of what negative feedback response is in this segment, and we'll try and apply our understanding to some different questions. So we ended off the last segment looking at negative feedback, and let's try and unpack that further to understand what is the mechanism in negative feedback. Okay, so the general sequence of events in a negative feedback mechanism involves the following 7 steps. So firstly, step 1, an imbalance is detected. That means there is a change, that is the stimulus. So go back to the 4 concepts. A stimulus is detected, and that's a change from the norm. So an imbalance is a change from the normal. The second step is that the control center is stimulated. So that's the response. A control center could be in the brain, it could be an endocrine gland like the pituitary gland. that is then stimulated. The third step would be that the control center responds to that stimulus. The control center will send out an effect. So we spoke about the effect now. The fourth step is that the message is sent to the target organ in the form of either a nerve impulse or an endocrine gland or an endocrine hormone. Step 5 would be that the target organ responds to that change. So we say that that's the effect that's going to happen. The response will happen from the effect. And then step 6 is it opposes or reverses the imbalance. The last step would be the balance is then restored. So essentially what happens is that the body will pick up a stimulus. That stimulus would be an imbalance that is detected. That imbalance is then going to be recognized by the control center as a change from the norm. The control center will then process that information and it'll send an impulse to the effector organ, which could be a gland, a muscle. And that's going to then respond to the change from the normal by bringing about an opposite or reverse reaction so that the conditions can return back to balance or normal. And that's essentially the negative feedback loop. So negative meaning an opposite, and response meaning a message in that opposite manner. So negative, again, a change in the opposite, and response would be a message to that change. Right, so we also have mechanisms called positive feedback. So in a positive feedback loop, the feedback serves to intensify a response until the endpoint is reached. Essentially, that means one stimulus having an effect on another, increasing the effect. And we'll look at an example of that in a bit. So examples of this control process, which is a positive feedback, would be blood clotting and childbirth. So during the process of childbirth, we have hormones that are produced, and those hormones will increase, which would assist the mother during the process of childbirth. So there's a positive stimulation increasing the effect of a certain hormone to bring about a change. So let's unpack that process in this illustration. So when the head of the baby pushes against the cervix, a nerve impulse is sent to the brain. So that's the process. When the baby's head pushes against the cervix, it sends impulses to the brain. The brain then recognizes that stimulus and it uses the pituitary gland to release oxytocin. So oxytocin will then respond and it'll increase in the bloodstream, and it will then target the muscles in the uterus, causing the muscles to contract. So as the baby pushes further against the cervix, there is more stimulation of the nerve impulses to the brain. There is a greater release of oxytocin. There is an intensifying action on the muscles of the uterus, increasing contraction. And hence you would know from chatting to your parents or your siblings or people that have had babies, you would know that the intensity of the contraction increases. And that's because as the process of the baby pushing against the cervix increases, there's greater positive stimulation, increasing the muscle contractions of the uterus because there's more oxytocin being released. So that is a positive feedback mechanism. Okay, so other examples of negative feedback mechanisms would be the regulation of thyroxine. Thyroxine is a hormone produced by the thyroid gland. So there are two glands that are responsible for thyroxine and maintaining metabolism. So the thyroid gland releases thyroxine, but it needs a stimulus. And that comes from gland 2, which is the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland produces a hormone called TSH, which essentially stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. So this hormone stimulates the thyroid gland to produce more thyroxine. Now, let's look at this in an illustration on the next slide. So as I said, you have the pituitary gland that releases TSH. When there is less TSH, it sends out less thyroxine. So the thyroid gland produces less thyroxine because there is less TSH. This would mean that the thyroxine levels tend to decrease. And that will bring the thyroxine levels back to normal. When the thyroxine levels are too low, let's look at the next slide. So situation 2, when the thyroxine levels decrease below the normal limits, the pituitary gland is then stimulated to produce more TSH. The high TSH levels stimulate the thyroid gland to produce more thyroxine. So that's the positive feedback now. So we're seeing more TSH, more thyroxine, eventually resulting in the thyroxine levels increasing and coming back to normal. And that's illustrated in this flow chart. So when the thyroxine levels, we start here, decrease, the pituitary gland produces more TSH. More TSH goes to the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland releases more thyroxine, causing the thyroxine levels to increase. When the thyroxine levels increase, they come back to normal, thus maintaining the balance which we refer to as homeostasis. So guys, that's essentially how homeostasis occurs. However, homeostasis does fail, which means that sometimes there's certain abnormalities. And an example of that would be your blood pressure or your blood sugar levels. These often sometimes fluctuate and result in certain chronic or acute abnormalities. Let's look at some of these. So homeostasis mechanism works continuously to maintain a stable condition in the human body. Sometimes, however, the mechanisms fail. When they do, the homeostatic imbalance may result. So that means there's an imbalance in levels of hormones, in which cells may not get everything they need, or the toxic waste may accumulate. If homeostasis is not restored, the imbalance may lead to disease or even death. And a typical example of that is the process of maintaining a normal blood sugar level. And we know that if you have a diet that's excessively high in sugar, at some point as you age, you have an increased tendency to develop a condition known as diabetes mellitus. And that is essentially when homeostasis fails, because the body now cannot control the blood sugar levels. And that comes in with a whole lot of other complications. Okay, so that's essentially homeostasis failing and resulting in an example of that which we discuss now is diabetes. Okay? Let's look at some questions where we can apply these concepts that we've just understood. So, the first question, what are the 4 parts of a feedback loop? And this was the first slide that we discussed. And so I'm going to read through these options, and I invite you to work through these with me as we look at these various options. So A, the control center, B, action potential, and the third part of that would be hormone, and the fourth part, an effector. B gives you a sensor as being one part, the pituitary gland, the control center, and an activator. C, the stimulus, a sensor, a control center, and an effector. This seems to be the most correct option. Stimulus, effector, neurons, because those are in the nervous system, and the sensor. So if you look at all of the others, it's C. And the reason why it's C is because we know that it starts with the stimulus, you have a sensor that picks up the stimulus, you have a control center that processes that stimuli, and then an effector that brings about the change. So the correct answer there is C. The next question, homeostasis in the human body is often maintained by, let's look at them. The neutral feedback loop, I haven't heard about this. The solar feedback loop, how enlightening, but certainly not correct. The positive feedback loop, or D, the negative feedback loop. And the question is often, and the question needs to be considered. So it's the negative feedback loop that is often used to maintain the homeostasis. Yes, the positive feedback loop does occasionally help, but it is the negative feedback loop that is most often used, and the emphasis is on the question and the word often. The cause for something to happen is is it the response? No, that's the change. The effect is the result. It's the stimulus, guys. So that is what causes something to happen. It's the stimulation, and that brings about homeostasis. So the correct answer here is C. So I'm going to skip through this, and I'd like to get through a question here that talks about the blood sugar levels. So we know that, you need to provide labels to the following, and this is essentially a slide that shows you the control of glucose levels in the body. So let's get onto that before we wrap up this section. So we have normal blood glucose levels that are maintained in the body. The scenarios are that, number one, the glucose level increases after a meal. The pancreas, an organ which picks up the stimulus, will need to release a hormone. And that hormone that it releases converts the glucose and stores it in the liver. So we know that the pancreas produces two hormones. The first hormone that it produces is called insulin. And insulin helps to convert the glucose and store that in the liver and muscles. So the glucose is converted into a complex form of sugar called glycogen. And glycogen is a complex carbohydrate which glucose is converted into. The glucose levels will then decrease because the glucose has been converted into glycogen. So there's a decrease in the glucose levels, returning the glucose back to normal. We also now have a situation where the glucose levels may decrease. And when they decrease, we know that this might happen when you've not had a meal, so it decreases, and you'll find that the body now relies on the stored glycogen. And so in order for that stored glycogen to be accessed, the pancreas will release a hormone called glucagon. And so the pancreas releases glucagon, and you've got the alpha and the beta cells that play an important role in this process. And that glucagon then will then be converted back into glucose, and the glucagon, is the hormone that helps to convert glycogen back into glucose. And so your glucose levels then increase, and bringing back the blood sugar levels back to normal. So we've unpacked these. So the first was insulin, as I mentioned. The second answer was glycogen. We said that it would decrease the levels, and then we noticed that when there was a decrease in sugar levels, the pancreas was going to produce glucagon, and glucagon was going to convert the stored glycogen back into glucose to bring it back to normal. So guys, we've unpacked the concept of homeostasis, and we've looked at how coordination happens between the nervous system and the endocrine system to maintain what we call balance. We also recognize that sometimes this balance can be disrupted, or we have imbalances, and these conditions could be because of abnormalities. We've unpacked one possible abnormality where we've discussed what happens with the pituitary gland and its hormones. We've also looked at what happens with diabetes and when the blood sugar levels change in the body. So guys, thank you for hanging in there. It's been a good session. I hope that you guys have enjoyed understanding homeostasis and coordination. I look forward to seeing you in our next session where we look at examples of how homeostasis is maintained in the body. From me, take care, go well, stay safe. Bye.